Good morning, everyone. What a wonderful day it is. I mean, today we are getting an opportunity to, learn from all across the globe and World Council of Optometry. A good day to start. And I'm so pleased to welcome you for this session of Dr. KB Wu. And thank you, Zhuangli, for the previous session. That was a wonderful, session. And now I will be your host for this session on behalf of Asia Pacific Council of Optometry. So just to moving ahead, before I introduce the speaker of Dr. KB Wu lecture, I would like to share with you some of the history of Mr. KB Wu. So Mr. KB Wu has had great impact and influence on the profession of optometry across the Asia Pacific and North America. Mr. Wu began his optical apprenticeship in Shanghai, and after finishing primary school in Suzhou, because of his talent and diligence, by the time he was 18 years old, he had opened his first optical shop, the Maochang Optical Company. When he and his family finally settled in Hong Kong, his business expanded to Singapore, Indonesia, and Japan. Mr. KB Wu believed strongly in education and professional advancement in eye care. He was one of the founding members of Hong Kong Optometric Association and had played key role in establishment of formal optometric education in Hong Kong. He has also inspired his sons and grandson to pursue the same goal. His son's profession, George Wu and Dr. Victor Wu, George being an optometrist and Victor being an ophthalmologist, continue the pursuit of the ideal of their father. By setting up KB Wu Foundation, they have supported many optometry initiatives. Professor George Wu took the helm of his father's vision and dedicated his lifetime to nurture optometry, practically in Asia Pacific region. He has served as the president of World Council of Optometry and the president of Asia Pacific Council of Optometry, president of Hong Kong Society of Professional Optometrists. His passion for optometry, his dedication, and consistent effort brought him many accolades from many professional organizations and universities. Dr. Stan Wu, the son of George, is the third generation of the Wu family to continue to raise the flag of optometry. He is the current director at the School of Optometry and Vision Sciences at the University of Waterloo in Canada. The commitment of the Wu family to the advancement of optometry is there for all of us to see. All of us here have probably directly or indirectly benefited from their endeavors. Currently, the KB Wu Foundation has spent over $2 million in the promotion of optometry in the region. Today, we have Dr. Andrew Lam as our KB Wu Memorial Lecturer. Dr. Andrew Lam is an Associate Professor at School of Optometry, the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. He is currently the program leader of the Bachelor's of Science in Optometry at the School of Optometry, Polytechnic University. He was a recipient of Department's Teaching Excellence Award in 2000 and also 2008. In 2016, Dr. Lam received the Garland W. Clay Award from the American Academy of Optometry. So my friends, today Dr. Andrew Lam is going to share with us today on OCT, which is it's simple, but actually not so simple. So let us welcome Dr. Lam. And before we start the session, can I request Professor Dr. Kali Lam and George Wu to present a garland to Dr. Andrew Lam. Over to you, Professor Kali. Wonderful. Pooja, can we have a photograph of this? That would be wonderful. Wow, what a great moment it is. I mean, it's a great honor to present to you Dr. Andrew Lam and sharing his knowledge about OCT. So welcome, Dr. Andrew. And now I'll hand it over to you.
Now I share my screen with the audience. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah, it's very clear, Doctor.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee inviting me to participate in this meaningful event. And it is also my great pleasure to be the speaker of the KB Wu lecture, especially receiving the gifts from Professor George Wu. To start my talk, so I first make a disclosure. I have no commercial and proprietary interest to declare. So here is the outline of my talk. Mainly, I will focus on OCT application and OCTA application for the posterior segment, because OCT can also be applied for anterior ocular segment imaging. Perhaps before I start, I would like to know, because OCT technology evolves quite quickly, just a very quick question. I wonder whether I can see the results. I would like to know who are not using spectral domain OCT. If you are not using SD-OCT, perhaps you can use the chat room saying that I don't, because I imagine quite a lot of you should be using SD-OCT nowadays, but there could be a few of them not using it. So just a very quick survey, whether there are anyone who are not using. For those who are using, then it's fine. You don't need to respond. So I can't see any response from the chat room. So everyone should be using the SD-OCT, I guess. And then who are using swipe source OCT, which is pretty expensive, I would say. So if you are using swipe source OCT, you can say, I do. Just have a quick check. I just wonder whether I can see it or I can't. Anyway, the reason for asking is because I would like to skip talking about the technology and mainly focus on the problems that we encounter in OCT and OCTA. So very briefly, is time domain OCT compared with spectral domain OCT, in which the scan speed is certainly higher in spectral domain OCT as well as the resolution. So sharing of the image from a review, you can see the high resolution from spectral domain OCT compared with time domain OCT. Nowadays, perhaps quite a number of clinics are using a swipe source OCT, in which swipe source OCT use long wavelength, usually 1050 or 1040 nanometer, with a better penetration, as well as a wider depth, in which we can see the vitreous cavity as well as the choroid at the same time. In 2016, IOBS celebrates the OCT of the 25th years since in 1991, the first paper published in Science by David Huang and James Fujimoto. So now we are still using OCT. And from their paper, with the launch of the commercial OCT back to 1996, I still remember the time that I used the time domain OCT Stratus in year 2002. It was so amazing. From this figure, you can see such a big jump in propagation involving OCT, in which ophthalmic use is the main discipline making good use of OCT. Here is a very brief summary regarding the commercially available OCT machine, starting from the time domain OCT with a very slow scan speed, and also a pretty narrow field of view to a lot of spectral domain OCT with pretty fast scanning speed nowadays, with a resolution from 3.4, the latest one, to around 7 microns. The last one is the swipe source OCT, the only commercially available. There are also some research prototypes. So swipe source OCT using a long wavelength with a very high scan speed, but there is a bit of compromise in the resolution. You can also see the field of view, quite a lot of them in one shot can have a pretty big field of view. I would divide, we'll first talk about OCT. I would divide the following presentation into problems in OCT in terms of during acquisition, and then I will talk about something after acquisition. If you are using the spectrologist, examiner can decide on how many number of OCT scan to get an average. As you can imagine, the greater the number of averaging, the better the resolution. So we can also see a pretty nice picture of the blood vessels, which cannot be clearly shown. But that is a compromise because the bigger the number of OCT to have an average, the longer the time, and also the patient may not be able to tolerate. So it really depends if the machine has a very good eye tracking system. Magnification is another issue. If there is an option for you to input some figures such as the spectrologist model, I keep reminding my students that if you want to have an accurate measurement, you have to input the individual corneal radius. Otherwise, the measurement results will not be accurate. But it depends whether this feature is available. If this feature is available, please use it. I will talk about magnification later on. I start with a case, the case that I came across. And this patient visited our campus optometry clinic in 2018 with an RNFL measurement because of glaucoma workup. And the patient returns half a year. Another practitioner used the first baseline measurement to do a follow-up. So just a normal follow-up in 6 months' time. When the patient returned in 2019, I supervised the student. So one RNFL capture, also using the first measurement in 2018 as a reference. After the measurement, I think this one is no good. Not because of this red index, because of, this is another image captured at the same visit, because of the previous capture with a floater. So a very tiny floaters may affect the measurement. Especially it affects the penetration of the laser beam, resulting in a thinner RNFL. So right away, just take another measurement, will do. Actually, vicious floaters has been mentioned by a number of papers, such as this one, also an RNFL measurement. In the first acquisition, the scanning circle is pretty nicely located around the optic nerve head. Now you can see the vicious floater, which now match with the laser scan, resulting in some red color. That means the measurement result is within just the 1 percentile. So that is abnormal. So the RNFL reduced from 78 to 58. Even worse is the vicious floaters now pretty aligned with the edge of the disc, makes the aggravant determine that the optic disc is very big. So the superior temporal will be overestimated, while the other region, the inferior nasal, will be underestimated. The same paper also have other examples to illustrate the effects of vicious floaters, such as the vicious floater also matched with the scanning circle, resulting in a great reduction from 132 microns to 47. And the floaters is still matched with the scanning circle, but this time does not affect the analysis too much. Another figures from the same paper also reminds the examiners that from their conclusion, they said that if there is vitreous floaters which match with the scanning circle, but as long as it does not result in wrong analysis, perhaps that should be fine. I have a different view because even if the vitreous floaters does not cause a wrong analysis, it does result in some reduction, some changes, especially these green, yellow, red depends on the normative database from different machines. Different machines will have a different ethnicity to build up their database, and healthy subjects with different age range and even different refractive errors. So we should not rely solely on the normative database. So as long as there is vitreous floater, I think simply you just ask the patient to change the fixation and then try to let the vitreous floater move away from the scanning circle. That is as simple as that. This is a patient, actually a young adult, with a lot of vitreous floaters. And it is not just in the right eye, but also in his left eye, just a young adult with a lot of vitreous floaters. So next time when you do your OCT, bear in mind the effects of the vitreous floaters. The next problem during acquisition will be the position of the OCT scan. This is also a case I came across during supervising the students. The patient had a baseline OCT scan, RNFL. When I tried to do a follow-up as much as I can, because there was background RNFL results, I found that the baseline measurement may not be very good in terms of the OCT scan location. So I did one more. Regardless of the focus, I wonder whether you know the difference between A and B. To be honest, when you are sitting in front of the instrument, I think that is pretty obvious. So this is the printout. The patient visited our clinic in 2020, and 1 month later, as a quick follow-up, another practitioner used the previous baseline to do another measurement. Perhaps the examiner, during the follow-up, did not recognize that the scanning circle was not ideal, I would say. And also the averaging was pretty poor, just 6 OCT scan to generate one rather than 100. So I did this one. So A was from the baseline, which I'm not happy with. B, I just did it again. And I told my students that actually there was some deviation from A. If you don't believe, I just draw a line connecting the edge of the disc to the measurement circle and copy it, paste it, very tiny, not a lot, but it can also result in a wrong estimation of the RNFL. As you can see, now the figures are present. It affects the nasal region. I told the student that very tiny nasal decentration. Because the further away the scanning circle from the disc edge, the thinner the RNFL will be. So not just the nasal sector, but also the inferior nasal, while the temporal one will be mistakenly measured as thicker. So I will believe in this one more than the previous one. This is another example that the patient visited our clinic back to 2017. And then the patient returned in 2020 in June. The examiners did another follow-up using the previous baseline. In 2021, January, another examiner also used the baseline to do the follow-up. I think this decentration is pretty obvious. While the right eye is pretty okay, but the left eye is pretty okay, but the right eye, I think the decentration is pretty obvious. because the scanning in the left eye is okay, so I'm happy to do another follow-up. But the right eye, I think it may not provide good information from the baseline because of the decentration. So I need to use another new examination to evaluate the RNFL around the peripapillary region, which is pretty obvious that the baseline does not have a very good alignment in terms of the decentration or the centration. This is another example that not a lot, but I would say it's pretty obvious if you are familiar with looking at the OCT print. Because of the decentration, so it results in a mistakenly underestimated RNFL from the decentered sectors. What if you don't rely on the RNFL scanning circles? Nowadays, quite a number of the OCT instruments do provide the rim width, such as this spectroless model. After identifying the Brooks membrane opening, or BMO, it will work out the minimum rim width, because especially eyes, myopic eyes, will have peripapillary atrophy, which is pretty common. So the scanning circle may match with the PPA, so it also cannot give you a very accurate RNFL measurement. However, it is still not ideal, because sometimes it is very difficult to accurately locate the BMO. In the spectroless model, it takes 24 scans with 48 BMO. From this example, the algorithm determined that this should be the BMO. However, because of axial elongation, myopia progression, actually there is some stretching of the optic disc. So this should be the correct location of the BMO. And you do need to go through all 24 scans to make sure that the algorithm does the right job. This one, I think, the same patient, just another meridian. I think it is pretty obvious that there is no way this is the BMO. So the minimum rim width will be mistakenly underestimated. But the examiner has an option to locate it to the right position. Leung and his group actually conduct a study by examining a lot of myopic and glaucomatous eyes. They used two well-trained practitioners to decide where should be the correct BMO. Even two trained practitioners still have difficulty to locate the BMO. In these examples, high myopes, long axial length, that is the main group with difficulties. However, the algorithm will still give you some findings. Another example from the same paper, so also high myopes, long axial length, pretty difficult to locate the BMO. While the algorithm will still tell you where the BMO locations are. So they found that really high myope, quite a lot of them, very difficult to identify the BMO, not just for glaucomatous eye, but also healthy eyes with high myopia, very difficult to correctly locate the BMO. In particular, the main sectors will be the temporal, superior temporal, and inferior temporal, where superior temporal and inferior temporal are the main sites for glaucomatous damage. I'm lucky working in a university clinic that we have the spectroless. We also have the size series. If you have the size series, so other than the RNFL, actually, it also provides the neural rim thickness, neural retinal rim thickness. You can move the scale bar to wherever you want, and you can export the NRR for each eye. It is quite tedious, and it provides with you the NRR from every 2-degree intervals. So you have 180 NRR. This is export results from a project group that I'm supervising. Is this NRR better than using the RNFL? A number of papers have evaluated the usefulness of NRR and RNFL. So in this Korean study, they found that NRR could enhance the glaucoma diagnosis compared with RNFL, in particular at the nasal and temporal disc margin. Another Korean group also found that the NRR, based on their built-in database, provide pretty good diagnostic accuracy, especially if compared with RNFL. NRR can reduce the false positive from RNFL. What is red disease? Just an example, from the RNFL results compared with the normative database, in this example, the RNFL consider the superior temporal and the temporal region at the 1 percentile of their normal database, that is red, and also the inferior region. However, from the fundus photo, the infrared photo, and the NRR measurements, actually, the neural rim is pretty healthy. So that is what we call the R disease, or the red disease. A Taiwan study also found that the NRR works pretty good, especially for those pre-perimetric glaucoma. So the visual field has not been affected, but the optic nerve head, the rim, already with glaucomatous changes. But there is still problems with the algorithm, also by identifying the BMO. Such as this Korean study found that BMO could not be correctly identified in 18% of the eyes, especially at the temporal and superior region. More important to us, because our population has a lot of myopic eyes. Myopic eyes with peripapillary atrophy, high myopes, rectal axial length will be affected more often. The same group, another study, also found that identifying the BMO may not be so easy, may not be consistent. For this eye, in 2 measurements, the BMO could be identified pretty nicely at the same location. While for this eye, 1 measurement considered this as the BMO, but cannot be repeatable in the BMO measurement. Also, especially in myopic eyes with PPA. If you have both the Cirrus machine as well as the spectrolus, because both of them provide neural rim width, are they compatible? So this study compare the NRR using both machines, and there is pretty big difference compared with each other. So they remind us perhaps it is better to use the same machine because they are not interchangeable. Actually, there are quite a number of other problems during acquisition, but I just focus a bit more important one in this presentation. So after the acquisition, there are also some problems that we need to tackle. The most common problem will be segmentation error. From time to time, students measure the retinal thickness. I keep asking different students, what should you look at? Most of the time, they just focus on the results. I have to emphasize that you need to check each OCT scans, especially if it highlights localized variation in the thickness, such as this example, that there is a wrong segmentation at the Brooks membrane, not just one, but also a lot. The other one, also a wrong segmentation. Even this location not indicate very red, but also a wrong segmentation. In this example, I did a manual adjustment. I remember I adjust more than 30 OCTP scans out of 49. It is quite time consuming, but you have to do so. Otherwise, you cannot get the correct results. But it will be very challenging if you come across concurrent macular problems such as ERM, which is pretty common nowadays. Even the software has difficulty to select the reference lines. For example, ILM in this segmentation, this is considered as the inner boundary, but in another scan just next to it, consider this peeled off retinal tissue, ILM, as the inner boundary. So that is really challenging for patients with macular disease. You need to decide that whether you can still rely on the segmentation, for example, to evaluate the ganglion cell, inner plexiform layer, etc. This is another example of RNFL scan and poor segmentation. Students, most of the time, will just tell me, I will evaluate whether there is a double hump, whether it is within the norm. I keep reminding them, the first thing you need to look at is segmentation. Because we know flaw effect, RNFL will never be zero because there are still glial tissues. Flaw effects in RNFL will be in the order of around 30-something microns. So if that is zero, it is because of poor segmentation. Especially in this case, there are nerve fiber bundle defects in the left eye, and in this patient, this is the first visit of this patient, bilateral normal tension glaucoma. I really want to have some quantitative data. As I said, I'm lucky enough that our clinic has also the size series, and it can give a pretty nice segmentation in different regions with some quantitative parameters. But unfortunately, there is also vitreous floater in the right eye. But no big deal. You just take another measurement, ask the patient to look around, and then take another. So as simple as that. I talk about magnification. If you are using the spectrolis, you need to input the individual K. This is a study comparing the measured results using the default 7.7 millimeter or the individual mean K, making reference with the calculated scan length. If you use the individual mean K, you will have a very good correlation between the measured results with the reference standard. While if you use just 7.7, the default, then the correlation dropped. They also estimate that a 0.2 millimeter error in the corneal radius will have a 0.1 millimeter of error in scan length. Does it matter for 0.1 millimeter? I think so, because it is 100 microns. So that is a lot. But whether if there is no such features for you to input the corneal curvature to compensate the magnification effects, if there is, you need to use it. What if it does not? Then perhaps you need to do your own calculation, such as the series machines. Leung et al. Did their own adjustment, and they found that without correction, eyes longer than the assumed axial length will have underestimation of the optic disc measure. I think that is serious to us because we come across a lot of myopic eye with longer axial length. So the measurement results will be underestimated. Vice versa, for eyes which is shorter than the assumed axial length, there will be an overestimation. If you don't do the adjustment, such as this study, the RNFL was found the thickest in hyperops, the thinnest in myopes, just because the examiner did not do the adjustment. After doing the correction, they have no significant difference because myopic eye longer than the assumed axial length have underestimation of the measurement results. So should we do the adjustment ourselves? That is pretty time consuming, but it is worth for doing so. After using the normed baseline, this was adult did their own adjustment. They found that using their adjust results will have a higher sensitivity and specificity than the built-in database. But it is quite time consuming. So that's why some manufacturers will have their long axial length database, such as this Taiwan study. Because Taiwan also come across a lot of high mild long axial length. With using their long axial length normative database, will have an increased specificity. So there will be less underestimation, less over-referral, so fewer false positives. So it's worth to use it. Its magnification really matters. It depends if you really want to have some quantitative data, such as this example. There is there are drosens in this AMD patient. If you want to do a measurement, you need to take the magnification into account because you want to categorize whether this patient falls into the category 3 or intermediate AMD, which should advise to have diet supplements. This patient I came across last month with an elevated mass at the choroidal level. I really want to do some measurements before I refer the patient to the ophthalmologist. Or another patient that our optometry residents come across recently, so a patient with full thickness macular hole, to have an accurate measurement in order to accurately categorize the patient into different stage of full thickness macular hole. So you need to take the magnification into account. I briefly talk about OCT and during the acquisition and after acquisition, there are quite a number of problems. So what have we learned? I think advanced technology is good, but you need to know more about it, especially the problems. If you would like to assign your ophthalmic assistants to do the acquisition for you, train them well. Then I shift to OCTA, which is an advancement of OCT. Very commonly used technology nowadays because non-invasive, dye-free, compared with gold standard of fluorescein angiography and ICGA. Anyone has not used OCTA, I think not necessarily all of you have OCTA, but quite a lot of instruments now also incorporate the OCTA features. It is simply taking repetitive OCT images to delineate the difference which represents the moving particles that will be the red blood cells. And from each location, after repetitive measurements, can generate a map to locate the moving particles and then to give you an infarct capillary plexus. Here is just an example of a field commercially available machines with different algorithm. What I want to highlight is a smaller scanning pattern will have a higher lateral resolution. But wide field is the trend. You will sacrifice the lateral resolution a bit, and different machines will have a different options for you to select from. Also, I divide the problems in OCTA into during acquisition and after acquisition. Artifacts, I just name one because artifacts already includes quite a number. Floaters, it is no different from the vitreous floater I mentioned in OCT. So if there is floaters, so it blocks the penetration of the laser beam, so you can't see the vascular plexus very well. Projection is also very common artifacts. It is the vascular plexus from the superficial layer, which casts a shadow when your interest is the deeper layer. Take this as an example. A patient after the OCTA acquisition, I try to see the superficial vascular plexus, which is nicely present. Then I decide to look at the deep capillary plexus. I can still see some superficial capillaries. And most of the OCTA machines nowadays will have a function called projection removal. So after you click it, then they try to remove those superficial for you to more accurately present the capillary plexus in a deeper layer. So is it doing a good job? How come there are still some blood vessels which seems to be from the superficial capillary plexus? You can go to read each OCT scan. In this example, the interest is the deep capillary plexus. Red indicates the flow. Actually, there are really capillary flows at the deeper structure. So the software is doing a good job. So these are really capillaries at the deeper layer. Eye movement also affects an accurate OCTA measurement because it has so many OCT in a short period of time in order to delineate the moving particles. So it depends whether your patient can have a very steady fixation. How can you tell if there are discontinuous blood vessels? It means there are eye movement artifacts such as this. Some algorithms can do a reconstruction for you, but it may lose some of the details after the reconstruction. I take this as an example. I have shown you, actually, the eye movement also affects the inferior part. Not a lot, but this is also eye movement. In this study by Holman, they recruit diabetic retinopathy patients using two very commonly used OCTA machines. They found over 97% of the scan image have artifacts. Among them, more than 50% have severe artifacts, including shadowing, eye movement, defocus, and also decentration, such as this. The scan deviate somewhere, so you compromise the OCTA results in particular sector. Actually, decentration happens in OCT as well. From this example, this Korean group interested in central subfield thickness artificially decenter the measurement a little bit, not a lot, just 200 microns will affect the subfield macular thickness a lot. Now we use GCIPL quite a lot to have an early diagnosis of glaucoma, especially mild glaucoma. In this study, the examiner also artificially moved the scan horizontally as well as vertically. So a horizontal deviation by 5 pixels or 1 pixel will affect the GCIPL. Because this horizontal scan is from 512 times 128 pixels, so the horizontal resolution is better. So 5 pixels horizontally will be equivalent to around 59 microns, while 1 pixel deviation vertically will be equivalent to around 47 microns. Just a tiny decentration will affect the results in OCT, also in OCTA. I'm a bit frustrated whenever I read OCTA papers because the authors may also include the OCTA scan as an example. I found that quite a lot from time to time, there is decentration affecting the quantitative data in particular sector. I think all examiner would like to have a very perfect OCTA scan. Because of a lot of the artifacts, I'm thinking perhaps the focus is a contributing factor to decentration. So I asked a group of final year students 2 years ago in their final year projects. We recruit low myopes and high myopes. They are all habitual contact lens wearers. We took 3 consecutive 6x6 OCTA in order to match the ETDRS grid. And when you export the information from the series machine from a 350 times 350 scan pattern, center will have a coordinate of 175 and 175. And the export data will locate the thinnest part, which represent the full field center. So it is easy for us to measure the full field deviation. For those low myopes and high myopes, if they are wearing contact lens, the fixation deviation are more or less the same. Because we took 3 consecutive measurements, so we can also measure the test-retest repeatability. When they correct with contact lenses, high myope had a poor fixation disparity. Fixation stability means the deviation among 3 acquisition deviate quite a lot compared with low myopes. And also even worse if used autofocus. So they took off their contact lenses, used autofocus system. High myopes will have a very poor fixation stability compared with low myope. Perhaps I use 2 eyes as an example. In this example, the upper 3 images were taken using contact lens. So the first one deviate laterally, one direction. The second acquisition deviate oppositely with an even bigger magnitude. No wonder the TRR from using the autofocus will be around 9 pixels. While if correct with contact lenses, there is still some deviation, but luckily, the deviation more or less at the same direction. So the TRR 3.6. The other example, even though the fixation deviation from the first and the third seems to be pretty big, but the direction is the same. The top one also using the autofocus. The bottom one using the contact lens. Even though the fixation deviation seems to be a lot, but the direction of deviation is more or less the same. So the TRR was around 3 pixels, not too much. So if you come across high myopes, habitual contact lens wearers, I think in order to have more stable fixation and less decentration, perhaps you can do your OCTA acquisition with their contact lenses on. Or quite a lot of the machines allows you to use the first one as a reference to capture consequence OCTA. So from this study, if the second and the third acquisition using the first as the reference, then the measurement results will be very close, better than using an individual acquisition, regardless of the first. So there will be a lot of variation. There are also some problems after acquisition. Segmentation. Most of the machine will give you the superficial capillary plexus and also the deep capillary plexus, some quantitatively. However, it depends whether the segmentation is correct. In this illustration, the first one, you agree with me that the inner boundary is wrongly segmented. It should be segmented like this. And unfortunately, the series machine cannot give you a correct segmentation at the outer boundary. While the spectrologist is doing a pretty good job, both the superficial and the deep. Although most of the machine at least will give you the superficial vascular plexus as well as the deep vascular plexus, they have different reference. Even though they are also using the ILM, IPL, and OPL for delineation, but they have different references. And just the superficial and the deep may not be good enough. Some researchers already suggest that it is better to have the intermediate capillary plexus as well. And the spectrologist machine allows the examiner to decide whether you would like to read the results from the deep vascular complex or you are interested in the intermediate capillary plexus. Because of so many problems in OCTA, so I also wonder whether taking several measurements would be better than relying on one. So I asked an Australian student who visited our school during the summer, so we conduct a study. By taking 5 consecutive measurements, use it as a reference standards. We use 3 × 3 millimeter with the highest resolution. And we compare the reference standard with the first reading, compare with the average of the first 2, and then average of the first 3, and average of the first 4. All 5 of them are pretty close to each other, no matter we are focused on perfusion density or vessel density. So here is the 95% limits of agreement. You can imagine that if we take average of 4, compare with the reference standard, then the agreement certainly will be very good. But it is time consuming. And also, I don't see any algorithm currently allows you to do the averaging. In our study, if we are interested, or you who are interested in seeing the effects from axial elongation, I think perhaps 3 measurements taking an average would be good enough. But it depends on your interest. Maybe your interest is diabetic retinopathy or other macular disease. Then you should decide on which limits of the agreement works best for you. But should we do it manually? I hope that the manufacturers will improve their software algorithm in order to allow practitioners to take several measurements and then do the averaging. Magnification is another very challenging issue. Dr. Sampson, in her study, illustrates the effects of magnification based on different axial length. This is a comparison of the same eye without and with the correction. So with correction, in this example, the axial length was actually shorter than the default axial length. If the axial length was shorter, then the image should be adjusted and then minimized. Then you can imagine the same area of interest should have more blood vessels. That is why after your adjustment for eyes which are shorter than the assumed axial length, after adjustment, there will be an increase in the vessel density. While for eyes which are longer than the default axial length, the vessel density should be even less. It affects us as well because we come across a lot of myopic eyes. But do practitioners aware of this? So this systemic review published last year revealed over 1,000 articles on OCTA. Half of them, the practitioner or the examiner should take magnification into account. But among these 500, only 8% did do the adjustment. All the others ignore the magnification effect. Perhaps the problem is it is not easy to correct the magnification. It is not difficult if your interest is a distance or an area. Use the same example. If your interest is the foveal avascular zone, before correction, there is an overestimation. After correction, the area should be smaller. But for vessel density, it is very difficult because that is a ratio. You need to first rescale your scanned image, and then you work out the vessel density. So it is not easy. And currently, I'm working with Dr. Sampson. We hope that we can have software and algorithm to help practitioners. So after I just briefly talk about the artifacts during acquisition and after acquisition, I think the same lessons that we learned, especially if you are going to rely on your ophthalmic assistant to do the measurement for you. So you need to train them well. But I have to admit that OCTA is the trend. So we should tackle the current problems, a few of the problems that we should tackle. For example, try to improve the resolution because histologically, retinal capillaries are in the order of around 5 microns. So the current transverse resolution of 7 microns, 10 microns are not good enough to pick up capillaries. I know there is already prototype, OCTA, which has a very high resolution with high scan speed. Perhaps merging AO adaptive optics. I know there are already some papers using this technology to reach the cellular level, but the scan area will be very small. So if you really want to have a big area, then it takes time. Wide field is another trend, not just the television at home, but also in OCTA. Either currently, we take several OCTA image and do a montage. It's quite time consuming. I know there are already prototypes which can get a very big scan area because of a very high scan speed. But there is some compromise of the resolution. AI and deep learning can merge with OCT and OCTA, aiding practitioners for the diagnosis of different ocular diseases. And I think perhaps the quantitative data from OCTA sometime can also give you a quantitative categorization of different flow rates. Because I supervise students, I come across with students that they pretty relied on new technology. And I was keep reminding students that you need to know well about the limitation of different technology. In Chinese expression, from time to time, I remind students using this Chinese expression or Chinese proverb. If you cannot read this, perhaps you can understand it now. A Chinese proverb reminding us that it is better to be without a book than to believe a book entirely. So I keep reminding the student, technology is helping you, but you need to know the limitation of it. So here comes the end of my presentation. I'm very happy to be the presenter, and it is really my honor to give the KB Wu lecture. I pass the time to Dr. Prasad.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew. I mean, I guess the topic which you chose, it is really not that simple.
No, that's true.
Lot many figures, lot many things, and people who are clinically driven would be able to understand it better rather than people who are more into just regular practice.
Mm-hmm. And also technology is evolving so quickly. So whenever there is a new option, I think we better understand it thoroughly before we really rely on it. Is it their connection problem? Oh, okay.
Right. So let us see if we have any more questions to come, and probably we will take that over. I mean, it was such a pleasure, hearing you, Dr. Lam. I mean, this is the first opportunity I got to hear you, and so great.
I'm also very lucky that I'm working in a university clinic that we have more than one device, and it is really expensive for us to devise which model we are going to purchase. So that's why we need to understand it thoroughly.
Wonderful, wonderful.
I think it applies to practitioners as well. Whoever invests in a very expensive machine, you need to know that you are spending the money wisely.
Right, right, right. So looking for any questions, which is probably so far, Dr. Andrew, I don't see any questions coming in. Maybe we'll wait for a minute. And
Or I really want to know whether there are participants who are using the swipe source OCT. We also have the swipe source OCT, but mainly for the anterior segment, because the swipe source OCT anterior segment device can also capture the posterior crystalline surface, which is very good. And we are also thinking whether it is worth to invest in a swipe source OCT in order to also examine the choroid, especially our school. Myopia research is one of the research foci.
Right. Well, as there is no more further questions, so I conclude this session, and thank you once again, Dr. Andrew, for joining us today. And thank you, the entire team of World Council of Optometry and Asia Pacific for, APCO to giving me this opportunity to be a moderator of this session. So friends, next session is next 1 hour, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Cindy Thomas, APCO President, and the session will start in next 1 hour, and the session will start with Dr. Cindy and Professor Tuani Rasanji. The topic will be visual perceptual skills testing and management. So looking forward to see you all in another an hour. So take care, have a break and enjoy the day.
Thank you.